All right, so I'm here talking with TJump, and Tom is an atheist. And Tom, you have a YouTube presence, over 10,000 subscribers, so that's pretty healthy YouTube following. And for those who might be tuning into this conversation before having seen the other one, this is actually a follow-up conversation. Tom had reached out to me, asked if he could interview me on his channel, and we did that, and we talked for a while and had a good conversation. I found Tom to be a respectful and thoughtful conversation partner. But the conversation was live, and his fans were kind of, let's say, distracting. And so we decided that for the follow-up, we would do this with using my MO, which is pre-recording it, no fans, not live, and no comments. So it just stands on its own. So that's what we're doing. And the format that we've kind of agreed on here is that I'm gonna it's my turn to interview Tom. So I'm gonna, Tom, I'll ask you some questions, and then we'll reverse it. You can ask me some questions, and then I'll ask some follow-up questions. We'll see how it goes. I will again just sort of preface everything by saying that I really don't consider myself an apologist. There are people out there, I think, doing a good job at Christian apologetics, and within the Catholic world, I've got some good friends who are doing Catholic apologetics. That's not really my thing, but I do like a good conversation. And you know, Tom, since you initiated this whole thing and got the ball rolling, and I agreed to do it, we thought, well, let's keep it going. Let's keep the conversation going. So now, when we talked the last time, I didn't really get a chance to get to know you very well. You were asking me questions and I was answering them. So I just thought we'd sort of start with, you know, tell me a little bit about yourself. Like, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? Where do you live now? Anything, you know, you're comfortable sharing as far as that goes.
All right. I was born in Dallas, Texas. I moved here and I was like sometime between 4 and 8. Grew up here, went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, had major depression my entire life. Started working on being social and trying to meet people by inviting professors out to coffee, talk about philosophy. And that's how I started my YouTube channel, and been forcing myself to go out and try and do as much social stuff ever since.
Okay. So you said grew up here, but I missed where here is. Where do you live now?
Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Oh, okay. Minneapolis. Yeah, I've actually spent some time there. I went to college at the U of M in Minneapolis myself. So, you know, I kind of know the Twin Cities a little bit. Spent probably off and on at least 8 or 10 years living in Minnesota. It's pretty cold there in the winter, but I guess that's one of the reasons why I came to Florida. So you grew up in the Catholic Church. That was another question I was going to ask you, because I remember you saying that you did have a church background and it was Catholic. So your parents, they brought you up in the church. Are they still around? Are they still Catholic? What's going on there?
I don't think they were ever Catholic. I just went to Catholic schools.
Oh,
But yes, they've always been very religious and they're still around. Don't really talk to them ever though. I haven't ever really talked to them even in my childhood. So
okay. So you guys didn't necessarily go to church on Sundays together as a family or anything. They just sent you to Catholic school?
uh we used to, I think, a long time ago. Don't
Yeah.
really remember much from back then.
All right. Okay. I see you got guitars in the background. Are you a musician?
I tried learning for a while. I just practiced like the hardest songs I could find. So what's it? Forget what was it? Eric something. Steve Vai's Eugene's Bag of Tricks was the first song I learned. The second song I learned was one of the top 10 hardest intros or something. And that's about the only two songs I really learned. And then a bunch of the smaller stuff like Star Spangled Banner, For Elise, Toccata and Fugue. So I never really got into learning music theory or anything. It was just
Okay.
the complicated stuff that entertained me.
That's really interesting. I kind of went the opposite way. I actually did go to college and studied music theory and composition, And I've written a lot of songs, but the mistake I made, in case anybody's listening who wants to get into music, the big mistake I made was I jumped too quickly into writing my own music without first learning, the songs by the really good songwriters or really accomplished guitarists. And so, um, I kind of skipped over the discipline and went right to the fun part, and consequently never got really good at it. So needless to say, music is not my day job, even though at one time I hoped it would be, right? So that's how that went. What about you? What do you do for what pays the bills for you?
YouTube. I'm full-time YouTuber.
Really? So wow, well, good for you. I mean, that's impressive. That pays the mortgage.
Yep.
All right. Well, that's encouraging to know that someone with 10,000 subscribers can make a full-time living on YouTube, because I would have assumed that it would take more like, six figures or a million subscribers.
Well, it's dependent on the like number of people who donate. The donors are really the big factor, not really ad revenue. Ad revenue is a smaller portion of your income. So as long as you get big donors early, then yeah, it doesn't really matter what the number of subscribers you have.
All right. So is that something you see doing long term? Like for me, I'm a little bit older than you. If you don't mind me asking, like, how old are you?
33.
You're 33. Okay, so you're the age of my son. I have a son who's 33, another one who's 30. Um, yeah, of course, my generation, it would never occur to us to do YouTube as a career, right? But is that something you see long term, or do you aspire to do something else at some point? Where do you want to go with
Uh,
this?
well, I've been doing it for full time for 5 years now. And it's growing every year. So I don't see any reason not to, but I
Yeah.
really don't have much planned. I mean, I'd like to start an atheist church. That would be my goal. I'd like to build an apartment building and offer affordable rent and build a community, like a commune kind of a thing, where we can offer affordable places to live and help people to do all the things that the government does really crappily. I'd like to start a private company that um, appeals the government to send us tax information. So, like, if you sign up to my tax company, we'll just have the government send us the bill because they do all your taxes for you. You don't actually have to do anything. And in every other developed country, they send you a bill, and if it looks right, you pay the bill and you're done, and that's all you have to do for taxes. But the government has a lot of red tape on what is allowed to do that because of TurboTax and all of the big companies that have lobbyists to make sure you have to spend money to give them for no reason. And I'd like to just start a private company that bypasses all that garbage and says, please send us the bill and we'll send it to the people who signed up, and then they can pay the bill and not have to do anything. And I think starting those kinds of private companies to bypass all of the legal red tape would be my goal, to make life easier for people, to decrease the cost of living for as many people as much as possible. That is the modus operandi, the principle that we live by, our doctrines.
No, I like that. I mean, I completely agree that the whole tax system is broken. The IRS is ridiculous and unnecessary. Um,
I feel the opposite. I think the IRS is extremely necessary, but they're auditing the wrong people. I think the
well,
IRS should be
yeah, but I
funded
mean,
more.
if we had a flat tax, you wouldn't need most of the system, right? I mean, to your point, you know, give me a flat tax, take it out of my paycheck, then you don't even have to send me a bill and I don't even have to look at it. It's just taken out of my paycheck. We're done, but I mean, as much as the idea of an atheist church sounds like an oxymoron to me, I like how you recognize that the government cannot do things well, and the church can do things better. Now, for me, of course, I would.
So much there. I'm just like,
Well,
almost,
yeah, no.
almost.
I mean, I kind of get what you're saying, but hear me out, and then you can respond to it if you want. But it's just like, um, historically, the church, the Catholic Church, the Christian Church has always done a better job of taking care of people than governments. Yeah,
No,
I mean,
no,
i-
not
the,
even
the,
close.
yeah, I mean, look, you're talking to the historian. The Catholic Church invented hospitals, hospice, all of that stuff. So yeah, I mean, the church has always done a good job of that. Right now, it's, very much stifled, but get the government out of the way. And I mean, I think there's something we can agree on there. Um,
Mm, I doubt it. So, well, the first thing is flat taxes are not the greatest idea. I think that in order to mitigate poverty, we should tax the poor less and tax the rich more. Have the flat tax be like for rich people, and then decrease the taxes for the poor people,
well,
which would
that's
then
fine.
be.
I mean, honestly, to me, we could argue this all day, but I mean, to me, a flat tax means everybody pays the same percentage. So the rich people are automatically paying more because they're paying the same percentage of a larger amount. But if you want to put a threshold on there where, okay, if you make below this, you pay nothing, I'm fine with that. But anyway, I mean, it is what it is, and I like your vision for for the things you describe for making life better for people. And I know you're not going to want to hear this, but it is a very Christian vision. It is very much consistent with the vision of the church when it's been at its best.
Well, I
Um,
wish more churches would adopt that, because the reason I would like to make this atheist church is because churches have a lot of opportunities in the legal loopholes they are given opportunities to access. And if more of them did adopt this kind of policy that I'm trying to implement, then the world would be a much better place. So I think that the weakness of churches is that they're not doing the things that I think are very easy for them to do.
yeah,
And I disagree where you said churches have always been better than the government at taking care of people. Like, to me, when I look at history, the greatest impact of healthcare, longevity of life, decreases of disease, has always been from healthcare supplemented by the government. And that's always
well,
outdone churches by such a huge margin. It's not even close. There's no competition. Churches just
no, I
don't
think
even
you're wrong.
measure.
I think historically, if you look at the whole grand scope of history, right? I hear what you're saying, though. I mean, in terms of like research and development for modern medicine, you've got governments and you've got big corporations. But the church has always been there with the actual care for people. But this brings up a good question that I was thinking about. Now, I was going to ask you,
Oh,
like, what?
before you go on, I just want to
Yeah,
mention the church benefits thing. I think there is a really important aspect that churches do well, far better than anything in the government or the atheist community does, and that's build communities. The one thing I'm really jealous of, that churches provide, is a sense of community and opportunities to meet people, youth groups, friend groups, family groups, people who need help. Like, oh, my car broke down, and you ask the congregation, anybody have a spare car I can use? Or I lost my home, can I stay at somebody's place for a while? I think churches do that extremely well, and I want to build something that has that aspect of churches for the atheist community. And so that's one area that I think churches definitely do extremely well at, that other communities don't do.
yeah. I mean, some churches are better at that than others, but I hear what you're saying. Yeah. So when you were growing up in the church and you were going to Catholic school and stuff, were you like, was your perception of the church that it was somehow opposed to science and scientific progress, or that it just sort of occupied a different space than science? Or, I mean, was your perception of religion and science adversarial or not necessarily? Or what do
I
you?
didn't think about any of that back then. Back when I was going to church, I had like suicidal major depression. I didn't have any time to think about anything else.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, you mentioned something like that, something about that in our last conversation. And of course, I don't want to pry or anything, and I'm not gonna, you know,
But it's all
put
right.
that.
Like, it's all, my whole story is on my YouTube channel in multiple
Yeah,
videos. So
yeah, yeah. Well, okay, so let's take this tack then. So, at some point, you'd grown up going to Catholic school and everything. So, I mean, did you at this point, during this time, sort of believe in God, maybe by default, or did you, in the back of your mind, you were just not believing but going through the motions, or where were you at during this time?
yeah, I was a devout believer. My hope in God was the most important thing to me that kept me going. Like, every morning, every night, I would pray to God, ask for help to cure for my depression. And it was the fact that he did nothing for almost 2 decades. That's why I completely stopped being able to believe.
So at some point you got to the point where you um made a decision, I guess, to stop believing in God. Now you bill yourself as an atheist. You call yourself an atheist, and I'm wondering why atheist specifically and not agnostic, for example. Like, for example, I wrote this book called "From Star Wars to Superman: Christ Figures in Science Fiction and Superhero Films." So I wrote this book, and as part of the book, I interviewed Ron Moore, who was the showrunner for like Babylon, not Babylon 5, the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, and he was one of the writing team, one of the staff writers on like Star Trek: The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine. So he's really sort of a major um, player in the science fiction world. And so I got to interview him, and the interview is in the book. And, at one point we were talking about this issue, and he also grew up in the Catholic Church, and he's what we call like a fallen away Catholic or whatever. And he made this comment, which I thought was very insightful. He said he used to call himself an atheist, but now he calls himself an agnostic because he decided that is more intellectually honest to say, I don't believe that there is a God, or I can't prove that there is a God, but I also can't prove that there isn't one. So therefore, I choose to call myself agnostic rather than atheist. And I'm just wondering, like, for you, where do you see the difference, and why do you choose to call yourself an atheist as opposed to an agnostic, for example?
Sure. So the first thing was, it was never a decision. I never made a decision to stop believing in God. It was just like, if you pray to a milk carton every day for like a decade and nothing happens, eventually you just stop believing the milk carton is conscious. And the same thing happened to me. It was more just over time having no effect on my life. I just stopped being able to believe it. There's no real decision. Didn't happen like overnight. It was just periodic. So like I'd stop praying as often, and then less often, less often, less often, until it just completely stopped. So there was no real decision for me. It was just lack of it having any impact or any effect on anything. Why do I consider myself an atheist? Well, for the same reason I think Santa Claus doesn't exist. It's not like I'm agnostic to Santa Claus. It's like we have good reason to believe Santa Claus is something humans made up in their imagination. And likewise, we have good reason to believe that God concepts are something humans made up in their imagination, specifically type 1 and type 2 errors. So like tens of millions of years ago, back when we were just an evolutionary stage of life, if you hear a rustle in the bushes and you think it's a evil lion or whatever and you run away, you'd survive. But if you're like, I'm going to be scientific and think about this and use the null hypothesis and wait for greater evidence, and there's a lion in the bushes, well, you get eaten. And so evolution prioritized the people who always thought it was a lion, even in the cases when it was the wind, because you had a higher survivability bias. Therefore, we have this hyperactive agency detection system. And so we see agency in all things all the time, even though it's completely irrational. So like, why do kids think there's a monster under the bed? Why do you get afraid of the dark when you watch a scary movie? Why do you see, I forget what it's called, it starts with a P. It's very similar to your last name actually, but there's like the syndrome where you see faces and things that there's no faces, or see rabbits in the clouds. Humans see agency in things inherently because our brains are designed to do that. And so I think it's rational to conclude that God concepts are exactly like Santa Claus, something that humans have made up. Therefore, I'm an atheist for the same reason I'm an asantaist. I think Santa doesn't exist. Not that I'm just
Well, I
agnostic
mean,
on
to be
Santa.
fair, there is a historical basis for Santa Claus. I mean, there was a historical Nicholas of Myra, a bishop who became Saint Nicholas, and then with the addition of pious legend becomes Santa Claus. So,
Well,
uh,
same with Jesus. So we also have historical basis for Jesus. But then when you get into the miracles parts, that's where it's like, that's probably fake. So I totally agree there was a Saint Nick, just like I think there was a Jesus. But when you start going to the miracles and magic thing, that's where it's like, probably human imagination.
yeah, and I mean that's where you and I disagree, because that's where I say that the logical flaw is in assuming that a lack of experience means a lack of existence. Like, I haven't experienced a miracle in my life, therefore they can't possibly exist. I mean,
Oh,
because
absolutely, that's right. So I just want to pick
yeah,
up
I
on that
mean,
a little bit. That's an argument from ignorance. It hasn't happened, therefore it's false. But I would say that there's good reasons to think it's product of human imagination, not simply that we haven't experienced. That's not like a good reason to think it's human imagination. It's all of the reasons in human justification that explain all of the phenomenon that religious people use to try to explain their belief in a God can be explained with natural explanations far, far better. And we have lots of natural explanations that would explain why they believe and everything that they think happened. And there's no reason to actually prioritize a God explanation for any of that. And so,
Unless you're one of the people who's actually experienced it, then all bets are off. I mean, so
what do you
you
mean?
just always remember this: when the bushes rustle, sometimes there really is a lion,
Yeah,
right? So, again, this sort of evolutionary priority, if such a thing exists, and I'm not convinced it does, but this evolutionary priority for believing something is there when it's not, doesn't negate the fact that sometimes something is really there. So, but anyway,
sure.
I mean, okay, so that's an interesting point you're making, because when you were interviewing me, you were asking me questions like, okay, like how do you know your decision to be a believer is the right decision? And for me, although I have had times in my life where I have made a conscious decision to continue my belief, I never had to make a conscious decision to believe. I always believed. I grew up believing, and so I never was like converted from unbelief to belief. And so for you, it's a little bit different, because you were, even though maybe you can't point to a moment of decision, you were over time converted from belief to unbelief. Um, and I understand your answer to sort of how you got there, which is to say, um, you perceived a lack of answers to your prayers. So you prayed and you perceived that the prayers weren't answered. I just
Well,
wonder.
to me, it wouldn't matter if they were answered. It had no effect. So even if their answer was no, it's synonymously the same. It wouldn't make a difference. Still no God. So,
Right, but I mean, yeah, and I mean, I'm sure you've heard the arguments. Well, as sometimes God answers prayer and the answer is no. But the other thing to consider is sometimes when God answers prayer, the answer is wait, and sometimes we wait a very, very long time.
but it wouldn't make a difference. So if there's no God, if there was an all-loving God, he would have helped. So it's essentially a proof there is no all-loving God.
Yeah, but
And so,
well, you know what? I want to revisit that point when
well, I just
we.
want to make up on one thing you said a little bit before. You said people who experience God are more justified. And I'd say that's false. I don't think so.
I
Just
didn't
like
say
people who
more
experience
justified. I
leprechauns.
just said, when you say that there are better ways to explain the experience of God, of miracles, and et cetera, apart from the existence of God, the only people who would say that are the people who have not experienced God and miracles, et cetera. Right?
No, that's most atheists have those experiences too. And so they still leave because they realize all of those experiences are better explained by natural phenomenon. So personal experience of a deity is extremely common in humanity. And that's better explained by naturalism than there actually being a deity. Just like if someone has a personal experience of a leprechaun, that's better explained by a psychological phenomenon, which there's actually a literal cognitive disorder that people literally see leprechauns. We have a name
Yeah,
for that. It was
I
talked
know. You
about.
mentioned that before, but I'm just saying, for the believer, right? Um, we would disagree with what you're saying. I mean, obviously,
Sure.
because our experience of God um, is not explainable in purely naturalistic terms. But anyway,
Wait,
let's
what? Like, I don't. What possible experience wouldn't be explainable in natural terms? Like, I don't understand that sentence.
exactly the kind of experiences that I cannot describe to you, let alone prove to you. They're very personal experiences.
Well, so like any experience you have is going to be something that can be reproduced by zapping you in the brain in the correct location. So it must necessarily
So
be,
you say.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that's true, but
Because, like, for example, the most profound experiences of God are from schizophrenics. We know that because we've studied their brain chemistry and they're
and how are you
significantly more
defining
religious.
profound? Because you're putting a value judgment on something here. You're saying the most profound experiences,
Yep.
according to whom?
according
Profound
to each
according to
case.
what definition?
So when you ask each individual the magnitude of their experience or the significance of their experience on every metric you could possibly measure it on, the schizophrenics like this was so much more profound. So on any standard that you were going to measure profound based on your personal experience, they're going to beat you out because their
But
brain chemistry is significantly better.
I'm not saying I have a better standard for measuring what is profound. I'm saying the very the very definition of what is profound cannot be measured, because in order for me to measure profound, one experience versus another, I would have to personally have both of those experiences and compare them. But I can't have the experiences of a schizophrenic, and the schizophrenic can't have my experiences. So you can't compare them. So this
Yes, you
whole
can.
idea of comparing this is more profound than that, I reject it entirely. It's impossible.
Well, like, so you can measure how much it impacted their life, how much it changed their personality type, how much they were willing to do things in accordance with this belief. So if you have a vision of a God who tells you to go dig a ditch that's 1,000 meters deep or something, if it's a significant enough experience to cause you to do that, then you're going to say it's probably more profound than if you thought you had a dream and then like, well, then it probably
No,
wasn't very
no,
profound for you.
because a person who's mentally ill will act on things that a person who's not mentally ill will not act on. And so you can't measure it by how much you act on something. It's
But,
these are all false measurements, because you
well, they're accepted in psychology and neurology. So like these are not in
yeah,
some
okay, but
psychological
that's fine.
conditions.
That's
So
fine. But
you're right in some conditions, but for others, no. Like schizophrenics have a perfectly rational, intelligent mind. It's just under certain conditions, they have seizures and their brain fires off. And so in those certain cases, they're not experiencing the same level of rationality, but those are temporary. And then once they're gone, they start to be able to operate on a relatively normal basis again. And so as a rational human
I'm
being,
not that kind of doctor. But the point is that they can't compare their experiences to mine, and nor can I. And certainly,
well,
a
Christians do this all the time. When you say like the apostles are willing to die for their experience, therefore they really believed it was true, that's a way to measure how profound the experience is. That's a way to say, yeah, they're not
sure,
lying. They
yeah, I
really
mean,
believe
I
this.
agree with that. And that, but if you tell me here's an apostle who was willing to die for his faith, and here's a person who was willing to, you know, dig a hole 1,000 meters deep, and willing to die to do that, those are not equal experiences. So I mean, it's just,
That's literally what they are. So if
no,
you have an
because
experience, well,
and this is
the
this is what
things you're doing, whether you're digging a hole or living for Jesus or willing to die for it, are literally irrelevant. The significance of the power of the experience is it enough to cause you to change your life drastically in order to follow or do whatever this experience is guiding you to do? It doesn't matter if digging a hole is irrelevant. The significance of the action is irrelevant. What matters is if this experience is enough to change your life that you're willing to die for it, regardless of what it is, then that's a level of profound significantly higher than one that's just like, oh, I had a bad dream, because you're not going to like
sure,
change your
yeah,
life for a
I
bad
do
dream.
understand that. I understand what you're saying, but the the specifics are not irrelevant, right? And precisely at the point where psychology and other cognitive sciences cannot measure them. So you're doing that thing again where you're saying, well, here are these sciences, and we're going to use science to put these parameters on religious faith and religious experience. And it's sort of like, trying to use um, I don't know what even, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but I mean, it's just your
A
uh
ruler to measure weight or something? Is that what you're going for?
yeah, I mean, you're trying to apply physics to metaphysics, and these are two different realms. These are two different things that, in large part do not answer each other's questions, right? So physics does not and cannot answer the questions of metaphysics, right?
Well, that part I totally disagree with, because I mean I'm a naturalist. So metaphysics is just
Well,
the
yeah, but
fundamental nature of reality. So if you're a physicalist naturalist, then literally metaphysics is just physics. But I understand the point you're trying to make.
yeah,
But I'd say that all of the evidence we have to try to measure the profundity of an experience, whether it's measuring dopamine levels, measuring the impact on someone's life, how they're willing to change their life, all of the evidence that we can compile says certain actions are more profound than others. Now, you can say hypothetically there's some unmeasurable that we have no evidence for, but that no evidence can't be used to justify your position. So you can't say there might be something else we don't know, which may indicate that my personal experience is more profound than theirs. Like, that's just an argument from ignorance.
No,
But all of the evidence we do have, the only things we can rationally base this on, indicates that the schizophrenics have a much more profound religious experiences than anybody else. There's no other data in any reference that shows that Christian experience is in any way more profound than theirs or any other religious experience.
right, but
All of the evidence indicates.
I'm saying that the whole concept of measuring profundity is a flawed concept, right? Because if there's a drug addict who will do anything to get more drugs, on that scale of measurement, that's a very profound experience, right?
Yeah.
But to say that the actions that the drug addict will undertake to get more drugs are no different in a certain sense from, you know, the way a person of religious faith lives their lives, I mean, that, you know, obviously that's not true. So
I'm not following. So, like, because the argument is, how do we measure the profundity of the experience?
yeah, I'm saying stop measuring profundity. It's pointless. It's not a measurement of truth, right? Because
What?
it's a measurement of subjective experience. It's a supposed measurement of subjective experience, right? That does not measure comparative truth between one person's experience and another.
Oh,
Right?
I totally agree. But you're the one who brought up the profundity. You were saying it's really profound.
No, you brought that up. You were the one who said that, you know, that there's this way of measuring that, you know, some non-religious experience is more profound than, so I'm just
Right.
saying
But the
that's
reason I
not
brought that
a
up was
valid measure.
because you said that religious people have this really profound experience, and so they're not going to agree that these things are explainable by natural processes or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I
And my
am.
response to that was, neither are the epileptics. The epileptics also think their personal experience isn't going to be explainable by natural processes. So the profundity, I agree, has completely nothing to do with truth.
No, I
So
mean,
just
no.
just just one second. Just
Yeah.
in the same reason we shouldn't use profundity to measure the truth of epileptics, we also shouldn't use profundity to measure the truth of religious experience, because you're right, profundity is completely irrelevant. So saying that religious people have a really profound experience, therefore they wouldn't agree it's explained by naturalism, isn't evidence for either one. I totally agree.
Yeah, well, then we agree on that. But the point is that, you know, science can explain the experience of an epileptic. It cannot explain the experience of, you know, a miracle or, you know, a lot of religious experience. At
Oh,
least
wait, those
not
are
to
like the
the
same.
satisfaction, not to the satisfaction of billions of people around the world. So,
Well, I'm sure the epileptics aren't satisfied with the natural explanation either, but again, that's irrelevant. Whether they're satisfied doesn't matter. There's an objective way we can say which explanation is better, which one makes novel predictions, which one can make expected data more relevant, which one has the most explanatory power. On all measurable data, the naturalism hypothesis explains religious experience, and the miracles doesn't at all. It's not even considered legit in any of the academic fields:
well,
neurology,
yeah,
psychology,
but
cognitive science.
that's because, you know, this is it's not, you know, this is metaphysics, not physics. But I guarantee you, if you say to the epileptic, I can give you a pill that will prevent you from having these experiences in the future, the epileptic's going to say, yeah, give me that pill. And if you tell a Christian, I can give you a pill that'll prevent you from having, you know, your religious experiences, the Christian's going to say, get away from me. So
Well, they both say both. So there are both examples of epileptics who don't want the pill and Christians who do want the
I know,
pill. I
but you
mean,
know what I'm
but
saying. You know,
well, no, it's a false analogy, because that doesn't actually explain anything. There are epileptics who like their experiences, and there are Christians who have lots of powerful experiences they don't like. So it just, the analogy didn't add up anything
yeah,
here.
but no, I think what we're getting stuck on is I don't have a need to explain anything, right? So you know, when I talk about religious experience and when I talk about the experience of God throughout a person's life, that leads a person to have religious faith, we're not really looking for explanations for those experiences. And this is where I think we keep getting stuck on this idea that, you know, there is a difference between physics and metaphysics, and physics was never meant to answer the questions of metaphysics. I mean, for that, I mean, on that point, metaphysics doesn't always answer the questions of physics either. Genesis is not a science textbook. Genesis is not attempting to explain to people, the processes by which God created the universe. Genesis is an affirmation that there is a God who is a creator, who did create the universe, but don't look for Genesis to be a science textbook. So anyway, I wanted to be fair with our time. So we've been kind of dealing with the questions that I started with. If you want to take some time, and if you've got some questions you want to ask me, we can do that for a little while. So I don't know if you had anything prepared.
Sure. What do you mean by physics doesn't answer metaphysics? That's like literally metaphysical naturalism literally does that. So metaphysics
Yes,
is
I,
just,
I hear you saying that you believe that, but I would argue that that's incorrect. It sounds to me like you're saying there's really no such thing as metaphysics. It's all physics.
well, metaphysics just means the fundamental nature of reality. That's all it means.
No, metaphysics means beyond physics. So in other words, the
No,
that which is metaphysical is that which is beyond the reach of physics and the physical.
no,
At least
metaphysics is the branch of
that's how I
philosophy that deals with the first principles of things. It doesn't, there's no beyond physics
Yes,
anywhere in the
well,
definition.
you're using a particular definition of metaphysics. I'm saying this is what I'm talking about. There are questions, and yeah, so there are philosophical questions that the science of physics cannot answer. So
I'm
if you,
not following exact. So like metaphysics in philosophy is specifically the branch of philosophy that deals with the first principles of things, fundamental nature of reality. That's what it means. So if you're a metaphysical naturalist, then physics would answer those questions.
yeah, and I'm
So
saying I am not one of those. And
right, I grant, but so
yeah, I
but
mean,
you,
but
when
but
you use the word metaphysics, are you talking about something different? Because if you're specifically saying the things beyond physics, then you're using the word to mean something different than what it's used academically, which is fine. But I need to
I
know what
mean,
that
I don't,
is.
like I said, I don't claim to be a philosopher, but I am using the word metaphysics in the sense of those things which are beyond physics, those things which are beyond the reach of, um, let's say, academic study according to the bodily senses. And so, to the extent that philosophy deals with those questions, yes, but if you're reducing the concept of metaphysics to so-called first principles, and you're saying that all of that can be explained through naturalism, I would disagree with that.
Well, I'm sure you would disagree, but
Yeah.
if you're saying that physics can't answer metaphysics, essentially you're just that'd be like me saying God can't answer anything. It's like it's just an assertion. There's no evidence of that. It's your opinion, which is fine.
No, I mean,
But
it's not an opinion. It's because I'm defining metaphysics as that which is outside of the reach of the sciences of physics.
right, so you're using the definition that's very different from the academic definition. That's where I was getting lost because clearly,
Well,
like if
as far as I understand it, that's the definition I learned. So I don't know what contemporary philosophers are doing with it nowadays, but I mean, there are philosophical questions that cannot be answered by science.
well, again, that's begging the question. So metaphysics in the Greeks, when they use the term metaphysics, just literally the etymology, meta means beyond, physics is beyond physics. But for like the past 700 years, metaphysics has been understood as like best understood through physics. So the word has evolved just like the word universe has evolved. Universe used to mean all things. Now it's just a subset of things. Atom used to mean the smallest possible thing.
All right.
Now
Well,
we know that atoms are made of other things. So the academic progress in the field over the past 700 years, it has not been used in that way.
well, I guess I'm a little behind the times, seeing as how everything in the last 700 years is current events for me. But here's the point. I believe that there are philosophical and theological questions that cannot be answered by the natural sciences. It sounds like you're saying you do not believe that, right? You're saying everything can be answered by the natural sciences.
Yeah, I'm a naturalist, so I think
Right.
everything is
And I'm
fundamentally
saying,
natural.
no, there are things that cannot be answered by the natural sciences. And these are the things of what I would call metaphysics, but these are certain philosophical um, questions about the nature of existence and about the existence of God and who God is and all of these things. And see, the problem, I think, is that when you define, yeah, or when you say that everything can be explained through the natural sciences, then you're stuck then saying anything that can't be explained through the natural sciences therefore must not exist. And I'm saying, no, there are things that exist that cannot be explained through the natural sciences. And, God is one of those things, right? So you're kind of, almost backing into an atheism via a sort of limited view of the universe that says, well, everything's got to be explainable through natural means. And if it's not, it doesn't exist.
Well, no. So I'm saying that there's only reason to believe all things are natural. Simply saying, here's something we don't know, and I'm going to assume it can't be explained by naturalism, is begging the question, argument from ignorance. So if anything we don't know about the universe, philosophical questions, origin of the universe, anything you want to pick, um, all of the evidence indicates naturalism is more likely to explain that in the future than any other thing we have. There's no other thing that has any evidence that may potentially be able to explain that. So inductively, it's like if we say, what works, chemistry or astrology? Well, trying to figure out a problem, say, what is pi to the 10 millionth digit? You're more likely to figure that out using chemistry than astrology, even if chemistry may never be able to answer that question, because we know chemistry at least works at some things and astrology works at no things. So if there's something that has no examples of it ever working, using it to solve an unknown, even if the unknown is like a different kind of question that we have no idea how to solve yet, it's more plausible to use a tool we know works at something than a tool that has no evidence it works at all.
Yeah. Well, again, where that breaks down is, in the realm of personal experience, where, you know, um, if a person says, well, we don't know whether palm trees exist, so what's going to work best to discover whether palm trees exist, and then you come to the conclusion that palm trees don't exist, but you're talking to a guy who grew up in Jamaica. You're bumping up against what people know to be true by their personal experience and by the witness of the people who came before them, which is what we ended up with in our last conversation.
Well, I mean, if there was some evidence that God existed, like if you could meet him and have him give you gold bricks or whatever, then yeah, that would be totally true. So like say God is living in Australia and you know God personally. He's like, God, you created the universe. Okay, show me, make me a gold brick. And he makes you like 10 gold bricks and you can show it. That's great. And then you travel to America and there's no evidence of his God. And you're like, yeah, there is. I've met him. He's done these novel testable predictions over there. That would be great. Perfectly fine to at that point be like, well, I'm rejecting the claim of the atheist that there's no evidence, but simply saying you have a personal experience which hasn't produced any novel testable predictions and hasn't been verified in any way is literally no different than the person who has an experience of a leprechaun. And so there would need to be some extra biblical evidence here that this thing exists independent of our imagination. Because if you don't have that, then it's exactly the same as every other psychological condition we know about. And that's really the claim the atheist is making. It's like, yeah, I know you claim to have these personal experiences, but do you have more than the guy who believes in leprechauns? And that's where the breakdown of the conversation is, because we've never been presented that. What is more than the guy who believes in the leprechauns?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's fair, because if you're faced with the Christian believer and the guy who believes in leprechauns, and you're asking the question, which one of you should I believe, then it becomes a question of how much do you trust each one of these guys? What's the background behind each one of these guys? How many people have believed in each one of these two systems, leprechauns versus Christianity, throughout the centuries? And what's the legacy, and who are the martyrs who died for their witness, and how is it passed down from one generation to the next? It becomes it comes down to questions like that, and then
Well,
comes,
I want to pick up on that really quick.
yeah,
Like, all of the things you listed are just completely irrelevant. Like, none of that is evidence of any kind. Like, I wouldn't care how many people believed in
and
leprechauns or
that's your
how many
problem,
people believed.
that
Well,
you don't care about that. That
well,
is exactly your problem, that you
just to
don't
clarify,
care
it's
about,
more
because
than I
you
don't
don't
care.
care about that.
It's more than I don't care. It's that these methods scientifically have proven are all unreliable. None of them work. They don't count as evidence for anything. Magicals, miracles, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, completely zero evidence. The historical context doesn't matter. The number of people don't matter. The martyrs don't matter. The
Do you,
how much you trust this guy doesn't matter. Like, I wouldn't, Isaac Newton came to me and said, alchemy, I believe I can turn iron into gold. I'm like, demonstrate it. I don't care. I don't trust you. I'm not going to believe you because I think you're smart. I need actual evidence, not your beliefs. I don't care how many other alchemists believe it. I don't care how many martyrs are going to die for. I don't care what the historical context is. I need evidence, and none of those things are evidence. So all of the things you listed don't give any reason to believe you're more rational than the leprechaun believer.
right, but I mean, my point is not to say you should have faith in me, but it does require faith. I mean, if I could say to God, geez, God, Tom's got 10,000 followers. If you could really manifest yourself and prove yourself to him, drop some gold bricks on his desk, he would become a believer, and then he could witness to all these 10,000 people. And I could go to God and say that, and God's going to say, no, not going to do that, you know, um, because God isn't manipulated, and also because at the end of the day, faith is faith. It's not based on proof. It requires faith, and so that is the place where it's always going to break down, no matter who you talk to. I mean, you could talk to the best apologist in the world, and I see that you have talked with some really good ones, but at the end of the day, you're looking for the kind of proof that very often God simply refuses to give.
Well, that's fair, but to me, that just sounds like you're admitting the atheist is right, because our claim is
Well, I'm
that.
not admitting the atheist is right, but what I'm admitting is that I will never be able to prove it to you. And I certainly didn't come on tonight, thinking I was going to convert you. I mean, you know, if your argument is that the existence of God can't be proven, then yes, you are right. If your argument is God doesn't exist, then no, you're not right.
Well, again, so my argument is that you have equivalent evidence to the guy who believes in leprechauns. That's the atheist claim. I have equally as much reason to be an a leprechaunist as I do an a goddist
Yeah, well,
atheist. Well,
right,
just to
and I
clarify,
hear that.
so when you say that it takes faith, and that if you were going to go to God and say, give him a gold brick, he's just not going to do that. Well, the leprechaunist could say exactly those words. Like, well, I could go to the leprechaun and ask him to give you a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but he's just not going to do it because
Right,
the leprechaun doesn't like being manipulated. And
right.
so, from an atheist perspective, your claims look exactly identical. You make the exact same
Yeah, I
claims, you make the
completely
exact
hear
same
that.
evidence.
I
And so,
completely hear that. But at least in my defense, I've never claimed that I was going to be able to give you convincing evidence, right? That's never been my claim.
all right,
All I can do is be one of many witnesses to it. And the problem is that if or any atheist sort of takes this approach that, well, the witnesses don't matter, the history doesn't matter, the way that the teaching's been handed down over time doesn't matter. If all those things don't matter, then we really have nothing to talk about, because that's what it's all about,
oh,
right?
I agree. This is the part that I find really interesting,
Yeah.
because from a scientific perspective, we've analyzed all of those lines of evidence, not just for Christianity, but for literally every belief. And we found they don't work. Like, they don't work. What's his name? The younger and elder, Plinius the Younger, Plinius the Elder. They wrote about the history of Rome, and they said Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, who was raised by a wolf, and no historian takes that seriously. These guys were well-acquainted historians. They're some of the best historians of the time. We take all of their work very seriously. We try to analyze it and historically find the battles they found, they like documented in archaeology. They are some of the most trusted historians in the world. But when they make miracle claims, we're like, nope, that's dumb. And this is the same for every single historian throughout all human history, the same standard for everybody. But for some reason, Christians say, well, in Christianity, it's different.
Yeah.
We'll take this guy a little
Well,
more
and here's
seriously.
why we say it. Here's why we say it. Because our own personal experience is such that when we read it, we go, yeah, you know what? That rings true to me because I have experienced things like that, or I have experienced the Holy Spirit in my life, or I have experienced things that corroborate those things, at least to a certain degree, at least enough that I've decided, and many like me, yeah, I'm going to devote my life to this. So yeah, no, I completely hear what you're saying. And yet, explain me, explain the billions like me, are we all deluded? You probably think so.
I don't
But
know if I don't know if I'd call it a delusion, because delusion has like a specific
yeah,
medical term. But I'd
okay.
say that if somebody had an experience of Romulus and Remus, I wouldn't say they're rational to now believe Plinius the Elder wrote about Romulus and Remus, and that's right, because they had a personal experience of Romulus and Remus. Doesn't matter how many people believe it. Doesn't matter how many experiences they have of this. Until you can show this is more just than imaginary, I wouldn't think it's rational to believe that the historical context of that mirrors your personal experience is rational. And we know that people do this. Like we know that, I remember Oliver Sacks, V.S. Ramachandran, and some other really big neurologists and psychologists have talked about visions children have of a large, rotund man in a red cape with a large white beard coming down the chimney at night. And they have these profound experiences of this guy. Are they now rational to believe Santa Claus is real? No, because personal experience doesn't justify claims of things independent of your imagination. You need more than that. And so
Well,
I'm
again,
fine.
you're looking for evidence. But to be fair to the ancient historians, though, you do have to separate um, the traditions they're relating from before their time and the things that they witnessed, right? So, in other words, if you have a Roman historian who says on one page, Rome was founded by these two twins who were raised by a she-wolf, and then on another page he says, there was this battle and I was there, right? One is he's just copying an older book, and then the other one he's giving an eyewitness account. And so we do take those differences into account within the Christian story too. But at any rate, I mean, I
Well, just to
think
clarify,
we
there are,
understand each other. It's just that we've sort of come to an impasse as far as um, this idea of to what extent personal experience can corroborate, the tradition, etc.
oh yeah, just clarify, there are miracle claims. All of the ancient historians have miracle claims both pre and during their lifetime.
Yeah.
So it's like we don't take any of them seriously. It doesn't matter when.
Well, but you know what? Maybe we should. Maybe we should take some of them seriously, right? Maybe
Why?
there are things. Maybe there are things that happen in the universe that we can't explain.
Well, yeah, sure. But the question is should we believe they did, or should we, what is the more justified position to take? Say someone wrote historical documents that unicorns existed in the 1300s or something, which there are other cases of that.
Right, I think you're too quick to rule things out. Um, I think you're too quick to limit what is possible.
Well, so like my position would be is it's rational to say the unicorn does not exist until we find like actual remains of a unicorn. If we find fossils, unicorn fossils or something, then we can go back and be like, well, now that we have this empirical evidence that there were unicorns, we can go back and look at the historical like accounts and say, well, maybe that was true. But until we actually have that empirical verification to show that it's not just a figment of their imagination, we have a large body of data that shows humans make stuff up all the time. It's very, very ubiquitous that humans make stuff up. And so if we're trying to say what caused this person to write about unicorns, what's the better explanation? And we have a large body of evidence of this psychological feature of humans that do this all the time, and no evidence that unicorns actually existed. The more plausible explanation is it's probably the psychological thing, not that unicorns actually existed. Now, obviously, it could be the case that there was a unicorn, he actually saw it, he actually wrote it down. But until there's some independent verifiable evidence to indicate that, the rational decision is never to say, yeah, unicorns probably existed.
Well, look, I mean, speaking as a historian, you're using the word evidence in a more limited way than I would. So you're saying, we have a document, and I know the unicorn is probably not a great example, but go with it as a generalization. Let's assume you have a document that says somebody saw a unicorn, and you're saying, okay, I won't believe it until I have evidence like a unicorn skeleton is found somewhere. But I would say, well, wait a minute. The very existence of the document is one piece of evidence. Now, we may choose to dismiss it. We may choose to find other reasons why the person wrote that than he actually saw a unicorn. But it is still one piece of evidence. If you have a document from, the year 1000, and it says, King so-and-so went out and saw a unicorn and tried to chase it down, but couldn't find it. Okay. We all know that, medieval stories have a lot of embellishment, and that's probably what it is. But on the other hand, the story itself is one piece of evidence, right? Which you may decide needs to be corroborated with other pieces of evidence, but it's still evidence. It's still something that may be based on, something that actually happened. So, we have to sort of understand that there's different kinds of evidence. There's and textual evidence is evidence. At any rate, I mean, I don't want to go in circles here. Did you have questions that you wanted to ask me specifically?
Oh, you said you were in Minnesota. Did you still any like contacts here? People like pastors, apologists in the local area?
No, not really. I mean, this was back in the 80s. I um, went to the University of Minnesota. Minnesota. Yeah, I see. I even say Minnesota like a Minnesotan, where I leave the N's out. It's Minnesota, right? I still say it like that. I went to the University of Minnesota, 81 to 85, and so no, I don't really have any. I don't know anybody. I don't think who's still in Minnesota.
Okay. Question about the historians and miracle claims thing. Just a Robert Lacona's paper. I like that. In there, he quotes Robert Webb describing the methodological limitations of historians, which I think is an accurate description of the consensus of historians about what history can and can't justify. It's like what is usually understood to constitute history is not making an ontological statement about the totality of reality. Rather, it is recognizing that the modern discipline of history focuses on a particular facet of that reality. And he goes on describing miracle claims. So he's saying that you're not allowed to make this kind of ontological statement that miracles exist, unicorns exist. You're only allowed to reference things we already know that exist. Like if we discovered fossils of unicorns, then we could say, yes, unicorns existed, then you can infer that back in history. But he's making the same limitation here that we need some kind of empirical evidence of the thing existing before it can even be considered as it actually being evidence of this thing occurring in the past as attested by their testimony. And isn't that the consensus among historians right now? And why is that wrong?
Well, I would argue that the existence of a story is one piece of evidence for the historicity of that story. Even if you should find a document that says, space aliens came down and built the pyramids. Okay, that story is one piece of evidence in favor of the story. Now, you may, like I said, decide based on other evidence to dismiss the story as non-historical. But I think those historians who sort of dismiss, textual evidence as evidence out of hand, I think are making a mistake. And there are those. And so I haven't read the article you're referring to, so it may come from sort of that branch of history that is maybe more limited or more skeptical. But I always argue that the existence of a story is one piece of evidence for the story. You may want more evidence before you believe it, and that's fair. But the existence of the story is one piece of evidence in favor of the story. So, I mean, I think because there's a way, for the most part, the survival of texts is not random or accidental for the most part. Obviously, it's possible for a text to accidentally survive. But for the most part, for ancient texts to survive to today, they would have had to have been copied, which means they would have had to have been um, believed to be important. And so the very fact that a text still exists from the ancient world means something about how that text was perceived. Now, granted, when you read the content of a text and the author tells you about what the world is like, you may be reading, you may be learning more about the author than about the world. That's true. Um, but still, that, you know, that the existence of a text is at least one piece of evidence. So I would maybe open it up a little bit more broad than what you're reading. But yeah.
Yeah, because the immediate things that come to my mind is like, imagine we were like 3,000 years in the future or whatever, and people were discovering fossilized books or whatever today. The vast majority of them are going to be Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, and nowhere in those books, except maybe the first page, does it say this is a fiction. And so, if they read them as if they were historical documents, would that be evidence that elves and dwarves and things existed, even though there's no fossil record of any of
Well,
those?
I mean, I can't speak for the people 3,000 years from now, but it makes me think of Galaxy Quest, where, you know, the aliens have been watching, you know, Gilligan's Island and the reruns, and they think it's real. Um, well, I mean, you know, the problem with that argument is that you know, those books are intentionally fictional, and they're
But the
in,
people in the future don't know that.
what's that?
The people in the future don't know that. They just have the documents, and there's lots of copies of these documents, so it was obviously very important to them in the past.
Sure, but the
Nowhere in
people in
these
the future would also know what kind of a publishing industry exists right now, how much of that publishing industry is fantasy and fiction, and what are the purposes of those genres of literature. Just like we know, we have a pretty good understanding about the different genres of literature in the ancient world. Not that they didn't write fiction, they did, but for the most part, you know, in the ancient world, a lot of times, you know, when they wrote fiction, I mean,
they
it's,
embellished.
oh, sure, yeah. I mean, and I mean,
So so just like as you said, in the future they'd know that we have a publishing industry that has lots of fiction books. Today we know that the publishing back then was embellished, and they made stuff up and they added things that weren't real, and there's lots of miracles and magic and mythical creatures. So it seems like the same argument could be made for both then and now, that we know that there are these massive flaws in the recording of the documents at the time period that make them pretty unreliable. And so we probably shouldn't take them at face value today. Comparing the 3,000 years ago and 3,000 years in the future, comparing today, seems like we could make the analogous argument.
well, but again, you know, if you're looking at Harry Potter 3,000 years from now, you're saying, all right, this is an intentionally fictional book. If 3,000 years from now, someone picks up you know, a book that's not fiction, a nonfiction book, right, and they know the difference, then they're gonna put more stock in the nonfiction book in terms of how much it describes the world we live in. And we do the same thing with the ancient world. I mean, we know what a fictional account was, and we know that, for example, the Gospels that are in our Bible were not written to be fictional accounts. They were written to be, you know, basically biographies of, you know, of Jesus and the apostles. I mean, not necessarily the way somebody might write a biography today, but you get the idea. I mean, they're meant to be nonfiction, you know.
Well, again, the argument is, suppose they don't know it's fiction and they pick up the Harry Potter in the future and no one knows it's fiction. Supposedly it's a
But that,
historical document.
I mean, that's not an analogy for what we for how we read ancient texts. We know
But
what we know which texts were, you know, fictional, and which ones are, you know, not. I
it's
guess, you know.
so that's irrelevant to the argument. The argument isn't about whether, it doesn't matter if it's fiction. The point is that, does the fact that it's in a lot of books written at some time period and we don't know if it's fiction or not, or we think it's real or whatever, does that constitute evidence of magic and miracles and unicorns and everything? And I'd say no, just like
Well,
the
I'm just
paper I read
saying
on historians.
you might say, oh, there's a piece, you know, there's a piece of evidence, but we're, you know, it's superseded by these other pieces of evidence or whatever. So the analogy doesn't really work for the publishing industry today. You know, I'm speaking as a historian with the ancient documents. It's not really the same thing. You know, I mean, if somebody picks up there, you know, the if you pick up an ancient document, if you find an ancient document that has survived, right? This is a document that if it was copied, it had to be hand copied, right? I mean, you know, it's a whole different world where, you know, they print millions of copies of Harry Potter. Obviously, some of those are going to survive. So, I mean, it's a whole different thing. I don't think it really makes sense as an analogy.
Well, I don't understand what the disconnect there is. It's like, for me, it's pretty obvious. Yeah, it doesn't matter what we find. It doesn't matter what the books say. That doesn't. It's irrelevant. The books, you can write down whatever words you want on a piece of paper. The fact that words are written on a sheet of paper isn't evidence that the words correspond to reality. For that, you need something else. So it doesn't matter if it's Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or the Bible or whatever. It doesn't matter when it was written. None of that matters. It's is there any independent reasons to believe this is true and corresponds to reality? Just the fact that it's written down, I don't care. Like if you
Well, I
can
hear
write
you,
down, I have $1
although
billion
I don't
in my bank
share.
account.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, although I do not share that approach to literature. Um, and I think that when you say that some outside evidence is required to corroborate what's in the text, you seem to be limiting that outside evidence to material culture, which is fine. I mean, that's important, archaeology, et cetera. Um, but there's such a thing as, you know, multiple texts corroborating each other. And at the end of the day, you know, the longevity of the ideas and the, you know, the tradition of the way in which uh, the Christian teachings are handed down within the institution of the church as well. So I mean, there's, you know, there's a lot going on there. I hear what you're saying, but I don't really share uh, your opinion that, you know, it doesn't matter whether it's the Bible or Harry Potter, it's all just words on a page. I would disagree with that. And, you know, I mean, obviously, I don't, it's not like I believe in miracles because there are old books that talk about miracles, right? You know, I believe in the existence of miracles. And so then when I read an old book that talks about miracles, I'm open to the possibility that that actually happened because I already believe in the existence of miracles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So like, I think of it as somebody today has personal experience of Romulus and Remus, and suppose we find that there are some documents that were written at the time when Rome was supposedly founded of accounts of people directly having personal experience of Romulus and Remus, and there are multiple corroborating documents from the time. I still feel like, yeah, none of that's reasonable to believe. I don't count that as evidence. It doesn't
Right, but
matter.
but you're saying that based on, in part at least, based on the content. So you're kind of, I think you're contradicting yourself because you're, on one hand you're saying doesn't matter what the text says, but on the other hand it seems to me you're saying doesn't matter how much corroborating evidence there would be. I'll never believe it because it's ridiculous, right? And so there is a sense in which you are dismissing it partly based on the content itself. And I mean, I'm with you. I don't personally believe the Romulus and Remus story as a historical fact either. Um, but I also don't believe that it doesn't matter what the content of the text is. I think it does matter. And, um, you
Well,
know,
I'd agree. So I think that this only applies to things that don't have an empirical basis. So, and this is the same standard used in history and law. Things that are miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, anything that has no empirical basis are things that are not reasonable to believe based off of testimony. And so all the things rejected in history are the miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs. There's also other stuff that we think are
yeah,
fictions or just
sure.
embellishments, but any of those things in that initial category are just offhand rejected initially. Just like in a court case, somebody says an alien stole my cow, and the insurance company should pay for it. They're just going to throw out the court case. No, we don't. There's
Sure,
no
but I
precedent
mean,
for aliens.
but you know, the problem is that for billions and billions of people throughout the course of history and billions of people today, we're not a courtroom. And the testimony of witnesses we trust does matter, right? And so we do believe things that you might think have no other empirical evidence to back them up, and we believe them anyway on the basis of the testimony of witnesses.
But should we?
Well, that is, I guess, a fair question, but you and I are always going to come up with a different answer to that question. You're going to say we shouldn't believe them on principle, and I'm going to say there are some things that are worth believing that you take on faith.
What do you mean by on principle? Because I would say that the same reasons law and history and science don't trust personal experience are the same reasons we shouldn't trust personal experience. It's kind of like,
Well,
the Me Too movement, the
that's
listen
what
and
I mean by
believe.
on principle. Yeah, that's what I mean by on principle. Like, so I'm saying, well, there might be things that law and science, there might be things where there's not enough evidence for a courtroom or a laboratory, but I'm going to believe it anyway, and it's reasonable to do so.
We'll take like the Me Too movement where you're supposed to believe any woman who said that they've been sexually assaulted. Like, that seems like a really important issue. Do you think it's rational to just believe anybody who says that, or should we probably wait? The law is probably the way to establish this, and we shouldn't persecute someone unless they've been convicted. Like, to me, it seems like maybe we should wait for evidence that's actually been adjudicated by like people who are experts in this field, and not just believe because it's an important issue.
Well, sure, but that's, that is, like, we're not saying believe everything everybody says. We're saying there are certain witnesses whom we trust throughout history, and we believe them, right? And we believe them in part uh, because what they're saying is based on these principles of 10 commandments and the law of love. So nobody's, it's not an accusation kind of thing, you know what I mean? So no, I mean, just because I don't believe everything everybody says doesn't mean I refuse to believe anything anyone says, just because their experience can't be proven.
Well, sure, but so my analogy is believing someone was sexually assaulted is there's lots of evidence of that happening in the world. We have lots and lots of evidence of that occurring. And so if someone says that, the probability that it occurred seems to be significantly higher than the probability a miracle occurred by somebody else saying it. So somebody else says Jesus rose from the dead or something. Which
Well,
of
I
these
mean,
two
so
claims
you
is more
say,
plausible?
but that's not, it doesn't have to be a contest. It's not, have there been throughout history, have there been more sexual assaults or more miracles? I don't know. That's not the point.
My question is more like, if we had some standard of evidence that says anything above this line we should believe, anything below this line we shouldn't believe, kind of a thing. The probability of somebody claiming they were sexually assaulted and it being true is significantly higher than the probability of somebody claiming they saw a miracle and it being true.
But that line doesn't exist. I know, I can tell how badly you want that line. You want a standard. You can say, well, if there's this much evidence, I'm going to believe it. And if there's this much, I won't. But religious faith, and especially Christianity, simply doesn't work that way. There is no line. There is no standard level of evidence at which you can say, aha, now that's enough evidence to believe. Because again, if there were, it wouldn't require faith. That wouldn't be faith. And it does require faith. That's just the way the whole thing is set up. The whole thing is set up is, is God saying, I want people to believe in me by faith or not at all, and therefore I will not be proving myself to the skeptics. If someone wants to be a skeptic, that's their choice because they have free will. But I'm not jumping through hoops, right? You want to believe in me, you will do it by faith or not at all. And that's the bottom line.
Well, to me, again, that just, it sounds like you're saying the atheists are right. Because, I mean, we do have that line for a lot of things. Like we have that line for history, we have that line for law, we have that line for science. But it
But
seems like you're saying that you just can't reach that line because you need faith. And so it's like, here's some evidence and you supplement that with faith, then you get above the line. But to me, that's like saying, well, we have some evidence of leprechauns, and if you supplement without faith, well, then you get above the line. And
well, sure.
so,
I mean, a person can have faith in leprechauns, right? I mean, that's obviously possible. But then it becomes a question of, are you putting your faith in the right thing, or are you putting your faith in something that is trustworthy, something that is worthy of your faith? And in the experience of Christians throughout history, I mean, I'm confident that I'm putting my faith in God, who A, exists, and B, is actually trustworthy. Does God do everything I want all the time? Of course not. You know, does God disappoint me sometimes? Yeah, if I'm too focused on what I want, or if I want God to do things my way. Have I been mad at God at points in my life? Yes, I have. Right. Um, but at the end of the day, I keep believing because I am confident that God is trustworthy.
Well, so I still wanted to pick up on this, like, to me, because it seems like you're saying the atheists, right? Because the atheists are saying, here's the line, you can't reach that line without faith. And you're like, you're right, you can't reach that line without faith. And so we're saying, well, then it's not reasonable to believe, but you're saying, well, we just have faith. And so here's the actual evidence for
Well,
Christianity. Say, here's the line where it's reasonable to believe. And it's under that line. So we're
yeah,
like,
I
we're
mean,
agreeing on that statement. I think it seems like we're agreeing that it's under that
no,
line.
well, okay. So let me say, first of all, I'm not saying that there's this much evidence, but with faith, you're going to get above the line. I'm not saying that, because forget the line. There is no line. You're never going to get above the line. Now, if you want me to say that believing in the Christian God and in miracles and in salvation and in heaven is, according to naturalism and science, unreasonable. If you want me to say that my faith is unreasonable according to your definition, I'll admit that it is unreasonable. It is something I choose to do, even though I haven't been even though it can't be proven to be reasonable by your definition of reasonable. I'm okay.
Okay, that's fair, but so I'm still hung up on this thing when you say there is no line. Because to me, there seems like there's a line for
I mean, yes, there's
science.
a line, but it's not like I've got this much evidence and I need this much faith to get above the line. For us, we're not trying to get above the line, right? It's just faith. It's like, okay, I mean, I can point to things that I think are evidence for the existence of God. We talked about that last time. But it's not like, oh, if only I had a little bit more. Or, for me, the gap is this much that faith needs to fill in. It's not that faith is filling in the gap between unreasonable and reasonable proof. It's that the proof is icing on the cake, if there is any, or the evidence is icing on the cake, if there is any. But it's all faith, and I'm not worried about my faith coming up to a certain line.
Right. And so, like, the atheist would say, the rational thing to do is to proportion your belief to the evidence. So you should only believe insofar as the evidence pushes you. And if the evidence pushes you above, you should believe. And if it doesn't, you shouldn't believe. And you're saying, regardless of where this line is, you have faith. So you're going above here no matter what. Um,
Yeah,
which seems to,
I kind of still want to reject the whole above and below thing, but yes, that is what I'm saying. It's like, if someone is going to say to me, well, your belief is disproportionate to the evidence, you believe too much relative to the evidence, I would say, yeah, I choose to. I choose to believe that much.
yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
okay with that. I'm super happy with it.
No, that's where from me it says like you're agreeing. It sounds like you're agreeing with the atheist. It sounds like you're saying that
Well,
they're.
except for the fact that I believe God exists and that
Oh,
I
right.
believe you can be in a relationship with God. Um, and I believe that I am in a relationship with God, even though sometimes I get mad at God, sometimes I get disappointed with God, sometimes I yell at God, but I believe he hears me when I yell at him. My name is James, right? That's in Hebrew, that's Jacob. If you know your Old Testament, Jacob is the guy who wrestled with God. I have wrestled with God, but I never
And the
stopped
guy
believing.
punched him in the balls.
Yeah, right. I think I was the one who got punched in the balls. But anyway, but yeah. I mean, I'm happy to admit that my level of belief is disproportionate to the proof. I don't have a problem with that because I don't need the proof. It's not about the proof, right?
Right. Yeah, that's totally fair. So, and I
It's
just,
about it's about knowing in my own heart and soul that I am in this relationship with God, such as it is. And I'm no saint. I mean, um, but but I do believe that there are times when you pray and the answer is no. There are times when you pray and the answer is wait. There are times when you pray and the answer is complete silence, and God's sitting there going, I'm not even going to tell you why I'm making you wait. And some of the most famous and most holy saints of our tradition have gone through periods, long periods in their lives when they felt God had completely abandoned them. Like, why would they have to go through that? I don't know, right? But here's the thing. Like, there's this classic argument against the existence of God from, evil or suffering. Like, so if there's evil in the world, there's suffering in the world. If God is really great, all powerful, and God is really good, all benevolent, then therefore there would be no suffering in the world. And there was even a famous book written a while back, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, written by a rabbi. And he starts with this question, if God is great and God is good, why is there evil in the world? And by the end of the book, if I remember, I wrote it many years ago, but by the end of the book, he basically comes to the conclusion that God really is as good as we think, but God isn't really as powerful as we think. And so there's evil in the world because God can't help it. Well, I don't accept that answer. I think there's a third answer because this whole argument presents it like there's only two possibilities. One possibility is God is who we think he is, and he's but or he,
he's
God
as
is
powerful, but not as good, or he's not as good, but as powerful.
right. And I think that classic Christianity says there's a third option. God is as powerful as we think. God is as good as we think, but there are reasons why God allows things to happen that we can't understand. I mean, there are things God does we can't understand, and then there are also things that God allows but does not cause that we can't understand. Um, and to me, that's the only answer to the question that doesn't require an arrogance on my part, because I'm willing to say I don't see the big picture. I'm willing to trust God and say, okay, I am not going to presume to make determinations about the existence or non-existence of God, or the goodness or power of God, because I'm much smaller than God and I'm limited in my perspective and in my intelligence. And so I will take the road of humility and say, there are things about this, there are things going on here I don't understand, but I'm going to trust that God is good and that God is great, and that, when it seems from my perspective that God is silent when I want God to act, or God says no when I want God to say yes, that there are reasons for that ultimately are for my own good.
Why call that humility? Because to me, that seems like the opposite of humility. Or just before I wanted to get into that, like you mentioned, like the point of atheism isn't to claim God doesn't exist. The main claim that most atheists make is that there isn't sufficient evidence for a God, and so that there's the line thing is below the line. That's the most claim atheists make.
Sure, but you do conclude from that God doesn't exist. Otherwise, you'd
Yeah,
be agnostic as opposed to atheist, right?
right. So same with like the Santa analogy. We think if the Santa's below the line, and anything below the line, you shouldn't proportion your beliefs to the evidence. Below the evidence, don't believe it, kind of thing. But yeah, so the main claim isn't that God doesn't exist; it's that there's no evidence, and that's why we don't believe. But to go back, why do you think that, or why do you call that humble? Because to me, if it's that seems like the opposite. So like if somebody says, I believe in a magical leprechaun who's going to stop the economy from collapsing or whatever, and the economy collapses, and you're going to be like, well, maybe he has sufficient reason to allow the economy to collapse. To me, that seems like arrogance, because to me, the humble thing to do would be to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And so if the economy collapses, the humble thing is to say that falsifies my hypothesis. I should probably make a new hypothesis. Or like a scientist, if we're trying to analyze the evil problem, and we say, what evidence would we expect? If there was a perfectly good God, it probably wouldn't be worms that eat out the eyes of babies, probably something we wouldn't expect to see. We do see that. So all the evidence seems to indicate the opposite of that God is all good. is there any evidence to say that this unknown hypothesis is the case, or is that simply an ad hoc thing we're adding in to try to save our hypothesis? And it seems more like the ad hoc thing rather than we have any actual reason to believe that's the case.
Well, I think the point we're missing here is that there's more we don't know than that we do. So even when even if you're in a scientific mode and you're compiling all your evidence, right? And if if there are 5 pieces of evidence that you have, well, there's 500,000 pieces of evidence you don't have. So,
Sure.
so, I mean, to me, and, I mean, maybe it's stupid of me to like claim humility. I mean, but the point is that I'm at least acknowledging the fact that my perspective is limited, and so therefore I choose to believe what is part of our tradition, which is that there's a bigger picture here that I don't see, and that at the end of the day, God has created the best of all possible universes, in spite of the fact that there are instances of suffering. I mean, evil is, for the most part, evil is the result of free will. I mean, God gave people free will so that if anyone chooses to, love God, believe in God, they'll do it by free will. But what that means is that they also have the ability to reject God and to do evil things, and people do evil things every day. But to take away the ability to do evil things is to take away free will, and then people aren't free, and then so I mean, you see, so there's that. But I mean, there is legitimate suffering in the world, and yet, um, I think God's end game is not, at the end of the day, our personal comfort in this life, but our relationship with God that results in union with God in eternity. So, that's the bigger picture there.
Well, for me, it seems like I don't understand why that would be the more humble approach here. So, like,
Well, don't get hung up on the humble thing. I mean, it's just sort of acknowledging that our perspective is limited and we
well,
don't
I
have.
agree with that part. That part I really agree with. So I agree with the Thomas Edison quote: "We only know 1 millionth of a percent of anything." So that part I agree with. But even if that's the case, which I think it is for both our perspectives, um, what is the correct decision to make here? Like, it's possible that we're all in the matrix, right? We could all be in like a big computer program, we just don't realize it. But is
Yeah.
that the rational conclusion to make, to say, like, physics predicted all this stuff we would see, and we have these laws of physics that are really good, and they work really well, but maybe we're a brain in the vat, and none of this stuff proves we're not in the brain in the vat. So is the brain in the vat a rational conclusion because it could be the case? Well, no, not really the most rational conclusion to think we're in a brain in a vat. And so the same thing applies to like God here. It seems like we have very good reason to think if there was an all good God, he wouldn't create worms that eat out the eyes of babies. We see worms that eat out the eyes of babies. So that seems to be evidence against God. So kind of like how you think that the historical texts that say written down is evidence that there were unicorns or miracles or whatever. This seems to be evidence against God. Now you're saying, well, it could be the case that God might have some sufficient reason to allow this, which is possible. But do we have any reason to think that is true? It's possible, but is there any reason to conclude that? Is there any reason to
Yeah.
conclude we're
Well,
brain
again,
dead?
that's a fair question, but I don't really think that the existence of suffering is evidence against the existence of God. It is certainly evidence that God allows suffering, but it's not evidence. I mean, it's an assumption that people make that says, if God is really all powerful and all good, therefore God would prevent suffering. That's an assumption that in itself is, I think, an unfounded assumption. But be that as it may, the point is, I don't think the existence of suffering is actually evidence, because it's sort of evidence, or it's making an argument from non-evidence, from the absence of evidence.
What do you mean? I'm lost a little bit. So to me, it seems like that would be good evidence. So like if there
No,
was
because it's based on the assumption that, if there's a God, this won't happen. It happened, therefore there's no God. And I think that's a flawed logic, because
well, it's just modus ponens, but
right. But the premise, if there's a God, this won't happen, is a false premise.
Why
So
would you say that? So like for me,
because
it seems like, well, just to expand the argument a little bit, to me, it seems like if there was a perfectly good God, it would prevent evil, whatever evil is. And if it's possible to create a world without evil or with less evil, and that world did not occur, then the God must be evil to some degree. So, like, if I can imagine a world without worms that eat out kids' eyeballs, and that's a pretty easy world to
right,
imagine.
but let's separate evil and suffering first of all.
Oh, I agree on the suffering. So, in my model, I think it's involuntary suffering is evil. Suffering on its own is fine. Like if you choose to suffer, if I choose to play a really hard video game that pisses me off, not immoral. But if
Well, okay.
it's forced on you against your will, that would be immoral. And so that's the part I would argue. It's the involuntary suffering.
Right, but back up. If someone chooses to drive drunk, right, and causes someone else to suffer, kills someone, causes injury, right? That is involuntary suffering because the person who's suffering or the family of the person, they are suffering for no fault of their own against their will.
Yep.
But it's still the result of the misuse of free will on the person who chose to drive drunk. So that's not on God. I mean, that happens
Wait a minute.
of free.
Wait a minute. So that part is definitely on God. That's 100% on God because God designed the physics of the world. So like if I designed the physics of the world, I would make it so it's physically impossible to crash into somebody without their consent. So it doesn't matter. You can drive drunk as much as you want. It's physically impossible to crash into somebody.
But now you've devolved into saying, the reason I don't believe in God is because God isn't the way I would create God to be. Like because God doesn't exist in the image of the way I think God should be, therefore there's no God. You can't do that. All right.
Well, it's not. It's more specifically, here is a logically possible way the world could be, which is better. If a perfect being existed, it would maximize whatever the better standard is. Since it did not maximize the better standard, it doesn't exist.
Right, but you have decided that you're the arbiter of what's better.
Well, I'm using
that's your job. That's
well,
above.
I'm using evidence. So
No.
the standard of better I'm using is moral philosophy, which is anything in philosophy, and I'm looking at a pattern in moral intuition and moral progress, trying to assess what we would imagine the best world to be. Or we can also do an internal critique and look at like what heaven looks like, supposedly, and try to, can we get a world as close as possible to heaven without infringing on free will? And the answer is, can it be closer than this world? And the answer is yes. So we can get a world closer to heaven without infringing on free will by giving.
Now you're just playing that game where, well, if I were God, I would make the world this way. And because I think that's best. And therefore, since God didn't make the world this way, there's no God.
Well, no. So there's two approaches there. One is that we can use independent evidence of morality to do that and say, well, there's a different standard of morality. This one's better than the Christian one. And that's a one route to go. But the other route to go is we can just look at the Bible. What does heaven look like? This is what heaven looks like. Can a world be created that's like Earth, that is closer to that world and further away from this world, which would then be more moral because heaven is morally perfect, presumably. And so we could say, if a world could be created that's closer to heaven, then it would be a morally superior world. And if God didn't do that, but could have, then he can't be morally perfect. So we can use an internal critique in Christianity to say that if Christianity is right, heaven.
I think there's so many flaws in that, I don't even know where to start. Because again, you're presuming all these assumptions that, you presume that somehow heaven, whatever that is, serves the same function as the universe we live in, and therefore they should somehow be more alike. You're assuming that,
well, the only assumption there is heaven morally perfect? That's the only thing we're looking for. Is heaven morally perfect?
No, you also have the assumption that you're saying that somehow it would be better if this world was more like what we think heaven is. That's an assumption too, and I don't think it's valid.
If by better you mean more moral, I would agree. But so the question is there any sin in heaven?
Well, I assume no. There's no sin in heaven.
Right. So heaven is morally perfect.
Right, but here's the problem, right?
But so this world is not morally perfect. Heaven is morally perfect. This world is not morally perfect, right?
But you can't make this world heaven without taking away the free will part.
Wait. So walk through me with this step by step. Heaven is morally perfect. Our world is not morally perfect. So there's like a spectrum. There's a spectrum of morality. Heaven is at the top.
You know what? I'm going to stop you right there because you are still putting yourself in the place of determining what is morally perfect, and you are using the same standard for heaven, and which we could do a whole show on what that is.
Well, this is an internal
Oversimplify.
critique. So I'm trying to use the Christian standard without imposing mine at all. So I'm saying by the Christian standard, because obviously I think heaven is terrible. Heaven sounds awful. I don't want to worship God at all. So from my perspective, heaven sounds awful. But in the Christian worldview, heaven is morally perfect. That's what I'm asking. In the Christian worldview, is heaven morally perfect?
I mean, yeah, but I wouldn't use that language, and I wouldn't assume that whatever makes heaven morally perfect, uh, therefore also is the standard by which this world would be better if it was more like that. I think that's an assumption you're making, and I wouldn't. So I don't think this line of reasoning is going to get us anywhere, because I think it's just based on these assumptions.
Well, are better and more moral are synonymous as far as I'm aware.
But you more moral according to
Christianity.
no. I mean, we would have to have a whole conversation about what morality even is in Christianity, right?
Okay, so in Christianity, is heaven, by Christianity's definition, is heaven more moral than earth?
Okay, again, completely like problematic assumptions, because morality is a function of the way a person uses free will, right? So you could say one person is more moral than another because one person submits their will to the will of God more consistently, or one person sins less than the other. But heaven is not a person that can be more or less moral, right? The universe, as God created it, is not a person who can be more or less moral, right? The
Right.
universe doesn't sin, heaven doesn't sin. So this is not working for me. This whole line of reasoning is not
Right. So that it's
doesn't
not,
make
I'm
sense.
not literally saying the location is moral. I'm saying the people in the location, the way they live is more moral than the way we live. Their actions are more moral. They have less immoral actions, more moral actions. It's a comparison of the actions and motivations of the individuals who live there. Is that world, heaven, a more moral place for people to live? Are they more moral? Do they act more morally? Are there less immoral actions in that world than
Yeah,
this
I
world?
think you know what? I think I'm going to have to say that the whole concept of morality becomes a moot point in heaven. So it's not really even a category that can be measured in that sense.
Well,
Um,
then doesn't that mean you can't say God is moral? Because if morality is a moot point in heaven, God is in heaven, then it's like
God
then
is
property is completely irrelevant now.
okay. I think you're getting outside your wheelhouse here, because you're trying to, you know, you're trying to do the job of a theologian in order to make an argument, but you're not quite getting there. Um, we don't talk about God being moral, more or less moral, because again, morality is the extent to which someone obeys God, submits one's will to the will of God, right? But God is God. So God is the standard. God is the one, that we try to measure up to. It's so you can't say God is moral or not. Morality doesn't apply to God in that sense. And so you're applying, it, it's like saying, the oranges in heaven are better than the apples here on earth. You're comparing apples and oranges, and it can't be done. It's not
Well,
working.
the question here is, does morality apply to the beings in heaven? And you're saying no, morality does not mean anything in heaven, but that
Not
doesn't make any
not in the
sense.
sense that it could be compared to morality in this life.
That's the part I'm lost here. So if morality loses meaning in heaven, um, for all of the angels and beings in heaven, morality just doesn't apply to them at all. but it somehow still applies to God. He's perfect. He's a perfectly moral being.
Well, I know it
But now it
doesn't.
just doesn't apply to any of the things in heaven. But then it applies to things on earth. This doesn't make any
It
sense.
applies to people.
Right.
I mean, it is a category that can be applied to people
And but we're still
in
people in
their
heaven, right?
earthly life, but after death, yeah, you're making a comparison that can't be made. You're trying to make a comparison that just can't be made. So anyway, let's move on to something else because that is just not working.
Okay. I mean, apparently we stop being people when we die. Is that we're no souls conscious?
Um, I think, well, of course, I can't speak from experience, but those who are in the presence of God in the eternal realm are in union with God to such an extent that, these things are not an issue.
Do we have free will in heaven?
Well, I mean, the story is, of course, that there was a sort of angelic rebellion, pre-human history, and that Lucifer is the result of an angel using his free will to rebel against God. Beyond that, I don't know. I don't know what free will looks like in heaven. I have no idea.
Okay. To me, that seems
But the point is that the argument that, if God is all powerful and all good, that there would be no suffering, is a flawed argument because we just simply don't have the big picture perspective. At least this is, what historic Christianity has taught. This is what I believe, that, to say that, God doesn't exist or God is evil because there's suffering in the world is just another way of saying that I have figured out what God should be like. And if God isn't like that, then either there isn't a God or I refuse to believe in the one that there is because I just refuse to worship a God who isn't the God that I think he should be.
well, it's more again an evidential kind of argument. So like, I obviously think it's a logical contradiction. So I think you can make a better world and give everyone free will without any involuntary suffering. That's something we can create. So God should be able to create it. But hypothetically, say,
Really? Are you sure?
yep, 100% sure it's logically possible. There's no logical contradiction. It's
And
easy to prove.
is there any possibility that you could be wrong about that? That there could be something you don't know that would make you wrong about that?
No, because that would make it a logical contradiction. So as long as I can show there's
no possibility in the universe that you could be wrong about that.
That would make it a logical contradiction. So for this to, the whole point of the claim is there is no logical contradiction with creating free will and no involuntary suffering. So yes, we can show that's the case very easily.
No, that's not true, because if people have free will, they unfortunately have to be free to hurt other people.
No,
and if they're not free to hurt other people, they don't really have free will.
Does Stephen Hawking have free will?
Yeah, I believe
he's a paraplegic. He can't hurt anybody.
Wait, he's dead, right?
Well, yeah, he's technically dead now.
So he knows
but
God.
When he was alive, he was a paraplegic. Yeah. Paraplegics can literally not hurt anyone.
Oh, that's
not. Do they have free will?
That's not true. He could say hurtful words through his little computer, and he could hurt somebody's feelings.
Okay, when I say hurt, I mean physical. So words aren't immoral.
Get on the internet and hire an assassin and have somebody killed.
So again, the question here is, before the internet, people are paraplegic. There are literally cases where one human is completely incapable of harming other people. Does that mean he loses free will?
Well, not entirely, but I mean, what's the point if the exception proves the rule? I mean, so what you can point to individuals who have less agency than others. That doesn't take away free will. That's not the point.
Right. So if every person was a paraplegic and was physically incapable of harming any other person, they'd still have equally the same amount of free will.
So you envision a universe, a better universe than this one would be one where everyone is a paraplegic?
No, I literally didn't say that. I am so silly. I hate it when Christians say such a silly thing. Like,
you just said that. I mean, look.
No. What I said is it's possible for everyone to have free will and to be physically incapable of harming others. The ability to physically harm others is irrelevant to free will. Free will is a psychological freedom. It doesn't matter if you're physically capable of doing things. Someone may be a short midget or whatever, physically incapable of harming someone. That doesn't infringe on their free will. The physical limitations of a body doesn't infringe on. If I don't want to fly, say I can't get up and fly, does that mean I don't have free will? No, your free
I
will
mean,
is the
I agree.
desire to do
Free
things.
will, free will does not mean the freedom to do everything. Free
Yes.
will does not mean unlimited freedom, right? But the existence of free will, if if humanity is to have free will, it has to be free to reject God
Sure. That
by,
part I agree with.
by rejecting God's commandments.
Sure.
And, and God has commandments not to hurt other people. Apparently we have the free will to hurt other people.
Okay.
But to say that because we have free will to hurt other people, therefore God must not exist, because I hear you saying it's logically possible to create a universe, where no one can hurt other people. First of all, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true that people could truly have free will and be limited to that extent. But even if you can envision such a universe, what makes you think that's a better universe than the one we have? Right? You're just basing that on your own criteria, and you don't have all the facts.
Well,
You
no,
just
this is an objection to your argument. Your argument is that we must have free will in order for the universe to be better or whatever. And
well,
so it's logically possible to prove you can have free will and no suffering. So let's say we teleported each individual to a different planet, and it was impossible for them to have the resources to go to meet each other. Well, congratulations. Like, their psychology is exactly the same. You have exactly the same free will in that universe as you do this one. So it's necessarily the case that everyone has free will but can't hurt each other.
But
It's
what
a
do you
very
lose
easy
by
example.
what do you lose by teleporting to your individual planet? You have no human contact with anybody else, right? So you've
It's
got
not an
to,
issue.
yeah, no, because you have to understand,
No,
maybe
no,
it's
just
possible
clarify.
to do what
Just
you
clarify.
say, but then you lose too much. You
No,
lose.
you lose nothing. You lose nothing. Because again, the point of a thought experiment is to isolate variables. We can make all of the social interactions still the same. We can give everything the same and just get rid of the involuntary suffering. It just takes a longer example. The point of this example is only to show you can have free will and no involuntary suffering. And here's an extreme example to show that that's very, very simple. So we can make a more complicated example. We can have all of the human interaction we have today, and it's impossible to murder someone.
I don't think you can, no matter how complicated you make the example, right? The point is that God knows better than you what kind of universe to make.
Well, no, we can prove this false. So I can give every individual a universe. They can design it however they want. It's impossible to enter somebody else's universe unless they consent. You can just say it's murder is impossible in my universe. Anybody who enters my universe can't murder. It's consensual relationship. They can all enter your universe. You have equally as much human interaction. So I solved the problem, because this entire world, and I can prove I can solve the problem, because I can make a world exactly like this one that we live in right now. Exactly the same rape, same murder, same worms that eat babies' eyes out. And the only difference is, to enter that world, you have to consent to be there. So now everything in this world is possible in the world I'm describing, because everything in this world is one of the possibilities in that world. So I now have logically proven that you can get rid of involuntary suffering by just giving people the option.
All you've proven is that you can invent a fantasy world in your mind. That's all you've proven. You have not proven that that fantasy world is better than the one we live in.
Again, so the point here is, there is no logical contradiction in a world without involuntary suffering. I can prove there's no logical contradiction because I can make it in my mind. And so
I don't agree that you can prove that, but it doesn't matter even if you could, because what you're doing, with these thought experiments is you are taking these like hypothetical examples, and you're saying, well, because I can put A and B together in a sentence, therefore there's no logical contradiction between them. They can both exist in the same universe. But you don't know that. You don't see the big picture.
So logical contradiction is a technical term in philosophy. It's a syllogism that there's no A and not A anywhere in the argument. That's all it means.
I get that. But the point is that that's not enough, right? I mean, that to show that there's no contradiction by the rules of logic, philosophical logic, is not enough to be able to say that I know this universe would be better than the one we have, and because God created the one we have instead of, or because the one we have exists and not this better one that I know about in my mind, therefore God can't exist, because if God did exist, he would have created the one that I created in my mind. I mean, that's just, it's I'm trying to avoid judgmental words. It's a certain kind of fantasy.
Well, again, so that the point of this argument is to show that, is it possible to create a world with free will and without involuntary suffering? Is it logically possible?
I
The
don't
answer
think
is yes. Saying
no,
it's better doesn't matter. Who care? I don't care if it's better. Is it logically possible to do this? The answer is yes.
no, I
Is
don't
it
think so.
better? You can make it
I
whatever
don't
better.
think
I don't
so,
care.
because that kind of free will wouldn't really be free will. And
How?
I mean, because you wouldn't have the ability to decide to love someone the way, or
Wait, that would be the same. That would be exactly the
no,
same
you're
in this
just
universe.
saying, oh, but I would put that in there. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to just
What?
create a fantasy universe and say that it's possible, right?
Wait,
It's not possible to have free will
You
and
seem to be
also,
arbitrarily saying that here's something I really like and it can't exist in your universe because I don't like your universe. That's all you're saying. So
no, no,
why would
no,
love
I'm
not be
just, no,
possible?
I'm critiquing what you're saying, because you're saying that I can envision a universe where people have free will but
Yeah.
can't harm each other.
Yes.
And I'm
Physically.
saying that wouldn't be free will.
How? So in this world, you said love isn't possible. You can go into someone's world and be in a relationship and marry them and be in their house and spend time with them exactly the same, but somehow love isn't real. It makes no sense.
I think it makes perfect sense,
How? What
because,
is the missing property in here that isn't love? I can't stab my partner in their sleep. Is that the missing property that makes it not really
well, I
love?
mean, that would be an extreme example, right? But the fact that you can stab your partner in her sleep, and the fact that you don't, it says something, right? That you are using your free will not to do that, right?
Okay, but that's not a
Don't
property.
If you don't have the ability to harm someone, then choosing not to harm them is not something you can choose either. You,
Right. So Stephen
you
Hawking
can't
could not
choose
have
to harm.
choose to stab his wife. Does that mean
Right.
he
But
doesn't
the
love
point
her?
is, if you can't choose to harm someone, you also cannot choose not to harm them. So when you don't harm them, that's not real love, because you're not doing it out of free will.
That's not what love means. Love doesn't mean I'm choosing not to harm you. That's not what
That's
love
part of
is.
what love
No,
means.
it's not.
Sure, because if I'm married, if I say something mean and hurtful to my wife, right? I mean, obviously I'm not
And
gonna.
you can still all the words are still available. You can still say mean things. You just can't literally stab them.
Okay, so you're limiting the involuntary suffering to physical violence.
Yes.
Okay, but what about the involuntary suffering that is the result of psychological violence?
If
What
you
if
don't
someone's
want,
in an abusive relationship where they never get hit, but they're verbally abused on a daily basis?
if they choose to be in that relationship, it's consensual. So if they don't want to be in that
Oh,
relationship, they
dude,
can
don't
leave.
even go there. If we had comments
No,
now,
no,
we would
no.
be getting comments from people,
In
because
my world,
not
you
say that
get your,
someone who's in an
in my
abusive
world, my
relationship.
example, you get your own universe. You can leave at any time you want by snapping your fingers. Every person has this ability in the universe I'm describing. So
Yeah,
in this world, if they don't like the relationship, they can choose to leave whenever they want.
yeah. But
No
at the
one
end
can
of the
stop them.
day, you have created a fantasy universe,
No,
and
God could create this with ease. Any all-powerful being could create this with ease. There's no logical
that
contradiction. It proves
that
that.
is true. However, the assumption that God should have done that is a false assumption.
I didn't say that at any point. The argument
Yeah,
here
but you are
is it,
assuming that, because
no,
you're saying that, if God didn't create a world without this involuntary suffering, and God should have, that therefore God doesn't exist. Well,
two separate questions. So the first question is it logically possible to create a world with free will and without involuntary suffering? The answer is yes. Is it better is a separate question. That's not the whole point of this argument is just to say,
I think I've answered this. I mean, I think we could go round and around, but I think I've answered this as much
You've
as
answered it with a non-answer. You keep saying a false thing. Like, this is saying that it's better. Like, no, it's not. It's completely irrelevant.
I'm saying.
Whether this is better or not doesn't matter.
Saying that that in your fantasy universe, you have compromised free will. That's not real free will.
Right. And that's
So
the question I keep asking about, but you haven't answered. So how? Because in
I
this world,
I explained it because plus you're just limiting involuntary suffering to physical suffering, and there's
right,
the whole gamut of psychological suffering and people saying
right.
hurtful words. You
No, that's also
every
voluntary.
time I make an objection, you're refining your fantasy a little bit, but it's still a fantasy.
No,
Right?
this has been refined in detail in all of my previous videos, so I'm changing nothing.
Yes, I'm sure you guys have worked on this really hard, but it's all bullshit. Look, at the end of the day,
You say that, but you provide no evidence. So what is the problem with having a universe where every person has their own universe? They can design it however they want, and you can choose to try to enter somebody else's, and if they allow it, you can enter. Then all of your words are consensual. You've consented
how
to
would you ever?
engaging.
I don't know. I mean, I can't play dueling fantasies with you, but that's not free will. That's not love, and it's clearly not the universe that God designed. At the end of the day, the bottom line is this, right? There is this third option to the so-called dilemma of the existence of evil and suffering, which is that we don't know the whole story. We don't have the big picture. And there are reasons why God created this as the universe that exists. And there are reasons why God doesn't prevent all suffering. And we aren't always going to know what those reasons are. I get that that answer is not satisfying to you. I get that that answer is not based on evidence for you, but that is the answer. It's all that is the answer.
Well, it's not, and that's the point, is that we
It
can
is.
prove it's not. But Christians can't answer.
It's not an answer you like, but it is.
Well, no. The objection here is that you're literally not answering the question. You're avoiding the answer. So,
No, I
the
mean,
reason.
I'm not claiming to have evidence.
Well, no. So the question here is, like, I keep trying to say, here is a way that we can show a world with free will is possible that doesn't have involuntary suffering. I never said this was better. I don't care if it's better. It's irrelevant.
But I said to you, that doesn't work because it's not real love and it's not real free will. And as far as I can tell, it wouldn't work. Now, look.
I can say the same thing and say a world that God created is not real love. No free will is possible. I can just say those things, but that isn't evidence. You're not answering the question. You're just saying, I don't like it.
I'm claiming not to have, I'm literally claiming not to have all the answers.
Right, but you're saying it's impossible for this. I have no evidence for this claim. I just don't like it. Therefore, it's impossible for this to be love. This can't be love. This can't be real love. There can't be any free will because I don't like it. That's all you're saying.
Not because I don't like it, is because it's not consistent with, our scriptures and our tradition.
Right, you don't like it. That's it. That's all you're saying. Like,
no, I'm saying, as a historian and as a theologian, it is not consistent with what we already know about what love is and what free will is and who God is. So
right, but only based off of
your fantasy universe would itself be a logical contradiction with what we already know about God.
Right. So you don't like it based off of your scripture and your predetermined definitions, which have no basis in reality. But if we're looking at scientific definitions of love,
they have every basis in my reality.
Well, sure, but if we look at any measurable definition of love that we know about, that we have a reason to believe it outside of imagination, that is possible in this universe. Everything we experience in this world right now is possible in this universe I just described. So you can't say it's impossible. You can't do it.
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't work. It wouldn't.
Again, you can't say
I am saying it. Hear me saying it. Based on everything I know, and I have a PhD in this exact thing, right? The history and theology of Christianity. Based on everything I know, the fantasy universe you describe does not have free will or real love. It wouldn't work. Now, I could, God knows, God has his reasons why he didn't create your universe. I'm not presuming to know for sure. I'm just saying.
I want to focus on that a little bit. So let's say we have world A, this world, the world we live in, has free will and love, right?
Killing me. Well, go ahead.
So our world right now has love and free will.
It does.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. So now let's say we make up another world where it has exactly our world plus a different one. Does that world have love and free will?
No, because if it's plus a different one, it's not exactly our world anymore. You
Oh
change
my
it.
God.
You don't get to change it. You're not God. Stop playing God with your thought experiments.
It's just
I mean, if you
basic
want to build a
entailment.
fantasy world, write a
Basic
book. This
entailment.
is not how it works.
So,
You don't
so
come in here with um, a sort of vague knowledge of
I'm so lost right now. Like, we have option A, this world, and that's all there is. Option B, you can choose to go to this world or you can go somewhere else. But now everything's lost. No love,
how would
no
you
free will. But it's the same thing. You can choose it, but now you've lost all of those.
So every individual gets to choose between these universes. How would they choose? How would they know which one to choose?
God can give them
Create a whole
minds and
universe.
knowledge. He can snap his fingers and give them, he can say, year 2022, everyone has this brain, so we're just going to give them that brain and that knowledge. Now they can choose. God can give them an iPad and say, here, select your preferred preferences. There's infinitely many ways to do that, but none of that matters to the question. The question was this: here is one world, our world, which we both agree has love and free will. Love and free will, has love and free will. And all I'm doing is taking exactly this world, making it optional. You could choose to go here and have all of those things, or you can choose to go to a different world. And you're saying now it's magically lost love and free will. Just giving someone the option to choose universe B, and magically love and free will are just gone now. That makes no sense.
Well, I mean, you have to give people the free will to choose between universe A and universe B,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
Right? Keeping in mind that the purpose of the universe is to prepare people for union with God, right?
Okay.
That is the purpose of the universe, right?
Sure.
So, you would have to, and I don't want you to, now you'd have to go into detail about describing universe B and how it's different and how people know which one to choose.
Why does that matter?
It does.
You can make it literal hell. Just make it say you can choose universe B is spikes in hell and gnashing of teeth. I don't care.
I mean,
why does saying you can pick universe A?
Now you've stumbled on the truth, because that is exactly the reality. We live in this world, and you get to choose between heaven and hell, right?
We're not talking about earth and hell. So earth, our current earth, living here on earth. The only thing I'm saying is different is you can choose to live here on earth and go through a life of cancer, death, rape, whatever, all of the stuff, all of the love, the free will stuff, it's all in this earth. Or you can choose universe B. It doesn't matter. Anything could be in universe B. It doesn't matter what's in universe B. Giving people the option to go to universe B somehow magically destroys love and free will, even though they could choose to go to the universe that has supposedly love and free will.
Yeah, because universe B, if universe B is the same as universe A, then there's no point in the choice. If universe B is different from universe A, then I would argue that whatever you're going to do to universe B to try and get rid of, your involuntary suffering is going to destroy love and free will. Yes.
It makes no sense.
It makes perfect sense to me. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. But at the bottom line is, regardless of whether anybody thinks, that I'm right about that, the point.
Wait. I want to pick up on this really quick. So you agreed that if universe A is just our God Christian Earth, universe B is the God Christian Earth plus a different option. This is the two universes that we have. And now if universe B had two options and they were both exactly the same as this one, you would agree they both have love and free will, right?
I guess if it's exactly the same.
Okay, now if there's two options, and one of them we get rid of all that stuff, one of the options still has love and free will, doesn't it?
Theoretically.
So this option B universe still has love and free will in that one place, and you can just choose to ignore it, right?
Well, right, but the point is that for those people who would not choose it, it would destroy love and free will.
So the whole argument here is that in this alternate universe I've created, love and free will still exist because this world we live in is one of the options.
Right, but unless everybody is in that option, then there's a subset of people who don't have love and free will.
That's fine. That's fine. Because the only point of the argument, the only point is just to say we can still have love and free will because I'm taking this exact universe as it is, designed by God, and saying this is one of the options. Therefore, anything in this universe is possible in my universe. That's the whole point of the argument. It's nothing else. It's just saying that everything in this universe is one of the things in mine that you can choose.
But for those who didn't choose it,
That's fine. Don't choose it. I don't care. That's not part of the argument.
Look, love and free will have to be available to everyone, or
they can all choose it. Anybody can choose it. It's there. It's an option for everybody.
Since when do people know what to choose that's best for them? Look, again, this
that's not part of the argument.
Experiment is pointless. It's completely pointless. It's an exercise in fantasy world building, but so what? Let me I think we need to wind down here because we've been doing this for 2 hours, and I'll tell you up front, I'm going to edit out some of this circular stuff, but
send me an unedited one, please, because I'll use it all.
Well, we'll see. The point is, okay, let me end with this. Indulge me for a moment and assume God exists. What do you want to say to God? What would you say to God?
I would verbatim quote Stephen Fry and be like, why child cancer? You're a monster. You destroyed all of these lives. You created such a miserable planet. What are you doing? You're so incompetent. That's what I would say.
All right. Well, I can guarantee you this. God would rather have you say that to him, believing he hears you, than ignore him. So, all right. I think we need to quit. But once again, thanks for the conversation. And apart from the fantasy problem, I think we actually had some good conversation. So I
actually think that part was really important because you did actually end up agreeing that it was possible. Love and free will were possible in my world, was kind of the point.
But not if everybody doesn't have them. It's got to be everybody. Everybody has to have free will, and everybody has to have access to real love. Otherwise, even because, I mean, look, people every day use their free will to sort of abdicate their free will. I mean, people do that all the time, but they always have the chance to come back to God. If you create option B, where you say, okay, we're going to have this universe that has a limitation on free will, right? You're going to create a world where people, are not able to believe in God out of real faith,
Well, if free will is somehow a law of physics, then I guess that makes sense, but it doesn't.
I never said it was a law of physics. It's metaphysics. It's beyond physics. It's not a thing that can be answered by science.
Well, because the only thing I'm limiting is physical interactions. That's it. So if it's not a law of physics, then it can't limit free will.
But that, that in itself limits real love and real community.
It doesn't make any sense.
Interaction. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, at the end of the day, we could all be in upload, but
great example. So if we all upload ourselves to consciousness, is love now free will? Are they gone? Do they dissolve away in the universe now? If we're all it
depends what the parameters are on the upload program. I mean, I've watched the show and I like it, but I don't.
Well, would we be able to overwrite God's free will and love through programming? Can we just nope, we're just going to delete those from human existence because we uploaded consciousness?
Maybe, I mean, you remember in the Matrix, right? Remember how the first version of the Matrix, everybody was happy. And what happened? They all went insane. And then they had to change the Matrix so that there were flaws in people's lives. So, I mean, you're going to, if you upload everybody into your fantasy world, they're all going to go insane. But of course I don't.
Yeah, because believing the story in the Matrix has evidence that that's truly going to happen. I don't think that's a great plausible explanation.
Well, it's as plausible as your fantasy universe. I mean, we could actually have a discussion about what heaven is like and what that means and all of that. But that's a bigger issue. All right. Well, I'm going to let you go. Thanks again for the conversation. And, who knows, maybe we'll do this again. So,
Yep. Thanks again. Appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, please just upload like an unedited one, because the more time watch is better for analytics and stuff. And so, but yeah, thanks again. Talk to you later.
all right. Talk to you later.
See ya.